let's open this debate.
Hey, am I audible?
Yes.
Great. I'll take POI from CO around 5:30. Please, POI is in the chat. Don't unmute yourself. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So if we lived in a perfect world, we would always support this particular thing. In a perfect world where everyone is adequate, is liberal, and understands people, and basically minds their own business. Unfortunately, we don't live in such a particular perfect world, and we cannot guarantee for everyone that this will be an adequate and okay experience, or whether or not in the worst cases this doesn't lead to, for example, you being exiled, you being harmed if you do these particular things, or just lose out your support structure. Let's get into the comparative that we're going to set up. Notice that since this is opposes motion, we just deny this specific thing. What does this mean? This means that in movies, we can still showcase, good aspects of gay or LGBTQ characters, right? We can show good characteristics about them. We can write good characters. We can talk about the struggles that they go through. We can, even to a certain extent, still talk about coming out, right? Like the motion says focus, right? Where we can still engage with this, but we don't think that the focus should be that much in this particular thing. So what is the specific problem with coming out? Because there are two options. Either some people choose not to come out and they feel psychological pains, or some people choose to come out and this is extremely problematic. That obviously we must weigh this to some people being pushed to come out and them living a good life, but we just think that our groups of people are likely to be quantitatively more and the harms are likely to be bigger than these particular things. So what are the psychological harms? Basically, when you see this in media, it creates a certain expectation that this should be expected to your journey as a person from this group of people. That this is the thing that you must go. It is basically portrayed as a necessary part of your identity and necessary part of your characteristics in this particular case, and it puts an unnecessary not burden, but unnecessary connection with what other people may think, your friends, your family, in these particular things. So first of all, because this is portrayed as some kind of key moment, you necessarily, psychologically, when you're watching the movie, you think that this is something important to you, and you think that this is something very big. Notice that specifically in many cases, movies and media are the first ways many kids around this planet actually engage in these type of things, right? Because they don't have liberal community around them. They usually go on the internet, they feel curious about themselves, they watch the movie, and that's how they get it. But secondly, usually within these movies, the process about thinking of coming out is also portrayed. So you, for example, may see scenes where for example, some people are scared due to the different outcomes. What happens if my parents disown me? What happens if my parents like me? What happens to my friend? What happens to these particular things? Which create unnecessary stress and create unnecessary anxiety inducing throughout the scenes. In many of these cases, because there is a shock value to media productions, because they have an incentive to sell tickets and do these type of things, because obviously this is about movies, it's not done in the most particular way. They want to portray this with dramatic music, with specific focus on the scenes and these type of things. Which brings it to third thing, which is that it overvalues the opinions of family members, relatives, friends, and these particular things. Because necessarily in coming out, the mechanism is that this is the object of focus of the storyline. Like this is, you are the subject as the character, and the object is this particular thing. But secondly, it usually is associated with either the climax of the series or the climax of the movie, right? So what happens when you actually do come out in these particular things? Or if it's not the climax, it's one of the more important scenes that are within these particular things. And the problem is that, again, the unnecessary emphasis is put on their opinion. If it's, for example, a happy ending, everyone lives happily ever after and everyone gets a catharsis. If it's a bad ending, it's something horrible and it's very problematic to the movie set. Which brings us to the fourth thing, which is, in many cases, movies and series don't show what happens after, right? Like you make a movie, you make a series that's short, and you don't necessarily know what is the case. So there is usually a cliffhanger moment within watching this series, which is what happens later, which is this particular case. Why is this harmful? Because it ingrains in society of many of these individuals that are within this community that this is something extremely important to their identity. That this is something that they should do, and if they don't do, their affairs. But many people would not want to do this because, legit reasons. They think their family might disown them. They think they don't live in an adequate society, which makes them feel bad in many of these cases. Makes them feel like they are very problematic in doing this sort of thing, or they're scared, which increases the anxiety in this type of thing. Now, all can say, but you can opt out of just watching. Not when it's this present, right? And not when this is the only media that you can watch that portrays your identity in this particular case. So you can't opt out. But secondly, it gives you impossibility to reconcile your identity. You will never feel, you will feel like basically a fake. I'm not gay enough because I do this particular thing, because I'm not coming out. Because a certain object, or a certain characteristics of the character is portrayed in these particular moments. Notice, On comparative, this doesn't happen because on comparative, when there is a lack of focus, these movies do not interact with wider society. Politicians don't talk about them. LGBTQ society also doesn't talk about them. Celebrities don't talk about them, which they do talk about now when they talk about these movies because there is monetary incentive to talk about this sort of thing, which means that these movies also impact how wider society views this sort of thing. But second mechanism is because kids watch these movies and they later either do it or it's an important part of their identity, they also talk about it and they have a fixed idea that this is something important, so it is normalized. So on their side, this is normalized, on our side, this is not normalized. So you have the space and you have the breathing room to tell yourself, no, I actually don't want to come out. I actually think it's perfectly legit decision for me not to do this particular thing and hide my identity from the relatives, or at least not feel the bad coercive pressure or the shame that you necessarily may feel from not engaging in this particular activity, which is horrible, this sort of thing. The way is very simple. Maybe some people come out and they have a good life, but for the many people who can't come out because of circumstances, they feel extremely horrible. This pain is all across their lives and continues to a far extent every time they think about this sort of thing. So it's necessarily something bad for not most people live in these circumstances. So because how do you say wider world isn't advanced as much as Western liberal democracies. So this is why this is bad. Before I get into second point, CO.
Literally all media is always going to be about people who have come out in the vast majority of cases, and people around you also who are part of the community.
No, dude,
this does not change the delta.
Dude, no. Like, let's take a second here. Let's breathe. If you say this, there is no debate. Like, you're breaking the motion. You have extreme status quo bias. You're not picturing the other world where this doesn't happen, right? And if you do it, there is no motion. Like, if you give it to them because of this reason, I don't know what to say in this particular case. Second point, in many of these cases, this will create psychological damage or bad outcomes because some kids will actually want to do it based upon this sort of thing. Because they think, like all of the analysis here, it's important to your identity. It's the first way that you usually interact with these type of things. And notice because kids, they're small, they're curious in these particular things, they do not necessarily adequately calculate decisions and adequately do this sort of thing. It will push some kids, to come out in this particular case. But the problem is that because they're small, they don't know about the world, they may come out in the wrong circumstances when their family won't react necessarily good to this sort of thing, when their friends may do this. Couple of harms. Number one, bullying. You're highly likely to be harmed or to be ostracized the more that you know these particular things. Again, we're not debating this in Western Europe. We're debating this all across the world where people have access to these movies. But secondly, your family is likely to disown you in these particular things because of their conservative beliefs, because they cannot reconcile your identity and would prefer you to be away because it's shameful of the family. Choose extremely good support structure you would otherwise be able to have when you don't do this particular thing. For all these reasons, no perfect world, OG.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that speech and welcome the Leader of Opposition to continue this debate.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll take POIs in chat. A content warning in this speech for mentions of harassment, discrimination, par for the course for this motion, but I felt it was necessary anyway. Having said that, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. It is important for media to focus on a particularly intense, personal, and untalked about part of LGBTQ life, and for government to silence it is tantamount to silencing the people themselves. First, what do these depictions look like? We think the focus tends towards more artistic portrayals about the experience holistically of coming out. So not just that coming out will be happy and good for everyone, but also that you may experience rejection, that there will be a long period of self-doubt and self-discovery about what you want to come out as and what reasons you might have to come out. There are many examples of this in the status quo that don't just say coming out is very nice and very glorified, like euphoria or sex ed or modern love. And the reasons for why it tends towards these and not just the singular glorificatory description that opening government defends is for 4 reasons. One is because of call-out culture. For all of opening government's arguments, the main people they would cater to would not watch this if it was something that was so tone-deaf as to encourage them to do something they would hate all the time. Secondly, is that they have an incentive to consult with subject matter experts that actually have a diverse and nuanced set of opinions on these things because they want to make it as authentic as possible, to sell as best as possible. Number 3 is that it tends to be more interesting when it's a variety of nuanced depictions and not just saying you should do this all the time one particular way, because it's more interesting when there's some conflict, when there's some introspection and intense, nuanced discussion. And fourthly and finally is that when there is a focus, you want to be different from other media that tends to focus on these things, which is why there's an incentive to show different perspectives. Maybe for some people it was good, for other people they face rejection, and the story is how they overcome it and still stay true to themselves. What is the implication of this characterization? This is not a debate about the glorification of coming out, nor the condemnation of coming out, and it's about the diversity that emerges out of the media focus on it by having more and more media talk about this very important subject. which means when OG's arguments are relying on the implicit characterization that it must be about pushing people to come out, if we simply show that their side defaults to that, because that is the main premise assumption that what these media will default to, having more diverse depictions will encourage people to focus on these things in a better way and be forced to come out less on our side. But the second observation I'd like to make it is, if you don't believe this characterization response, consider that this is at minimum a very marginal increase in pressure into a form of media to the many pre-existing pressures. There are 4 such pressures. One is that you feel trapped and guilty. You feel like you're lying and hiding behind yourself even without this media. Number 2 is that there are many expressions of identity that are necessarily public that are vital to your feeling safe in yourself, like dressing for the gender you feel like you really are, or being called by the name that you feel like you really are. These are necessarily public, which means maybe there's no existing pressure, maybe there's no pressure, additional pressure from Gov, but there's still a massive amount of pressure, and hence the debate should be weighed on who makes it easier to come out, and opening government has no answer for that so far. Our first argument is quite simple, that media depictions are incredibly important, and the premise upon which this is stood on is that coming out is an intensely personal, scarce, and for many, a very integral part of being lesbian, gay, trans, and bi. There tends not to be a lot of literature on this by this construction, and there also tends to be a taboo around this. That is, if you come to talk with it about other people, it tends to be implicating. It tends to imply that you might be coming out yourself, which is why it's so hard to talk about. Why then are media depictions incredibly important? It is good for the people in the closet or otherwise face the challenge of coming out for 4 reasons. The first is that if nothing else, it validates their feelings. Feeling afraid is normal. Feeling unsure of your identity is normal. And for many people in government, they never achieve this catharsis. This focus is so important not only because it creates a diversity of portrayals that means you can select the one that best identifies with you, but the absence of this and the obverse space of not having this diversity of portrayals would mean that when you look at this media, it invalidates your opinion because nothing represents you, which means you feel strange and abnormal and you experience much of the mental disorder that makes you feel alienated. The second reason for why this is good is because it creates community. That is, it creates fandoms around this media. It creates people that support and understand this media, which one develops a veil of illusion. You can talk and engage with these topics and understand with these topics more without being implicated. You can just be a fan of Glee or of Euphoria instead of being potentially at risk from your family, which means you can better understand these topics yourself. But you also don't feel so alone. Other people feel the same way. Other people have the same experience as you, which is deeply important, particularly for a particularly isolated group of individuals. But beyond that, thirdly, the third reason for why this is good is because it makes your social circles more easily prepared. This is the crushing thing for government, because they assume that it constantly remains hard to be engaged with and it constantly remains hard to come out. When what we actually say is that a large source of harm, a large source of harmfulness and bad reactions to coming out comes from one, the shock that makes them unprepared to handle these things, for them accidentally dead naming you, for them accidentally, saying, oh, are you a she now? And other harmful statements like this, because they've never seen it happen before and they don't know what it's like and they don't know that it's very, very important to you. So it's not just the knowledge of how to do it, but the understanding and the empathy of its importance in the first place. Beyond that, it smooths the pressure and the process by a lot, by normalizing it, by reassuring parents that this is something that many people go through and that your family isn't to be shamed for it, and more importantly, that this is a normal part of life. In addition to the fact that this, persuades a very large amount of the majority that aren't immediately predisposed or at the very least aren't outright hateful, maybe subtly hateful, but are still willing to potentially watch this media, which is about 50 to 60% of parents. This is also substantially more persuasive to the conservative and Republicans who might never be swayed by anything else. Because one is this could be anyone. This could be your kid going through these struggles. But secondly is that it appears to a particularly primal fear that you might be doing damage to the person you love the most. And hence, as a direct result of this media is particularly convincing due to its focus. So the impact of this is quite simple. The first is that this is a particularly important depiction that helps a lot of people through a very scary part of their life that not only directly leads to many mental disorders, directly leads to lifelong anxieties, self-harm, and other things. It is also just an integral part of you being able to feel safe in your own body. But secondly, that there's a very large amount of people that face this problem, and hence, as a matter of scope and scale, this is immense. I'll take a POI from CD.
Yeah, due to algorithms, profit incentives are lowest common denominator incentives. They're going to show you mainly positive portrayals. So the ability for you to have a diversity and understand how to come out is not going to be that high on your side of the house.
Due to algorithms is such a loaded phrase. I mean, algorithms could also say that means you can find the media that best selects for you, right? So algorithms actually make it less common denominator because your Netflix recommendations are tailored to you. You won't get the, one that says, oh, because you're in a conservative country, yeah, you should totally tell everyone about these things forever, right? In fact, Netflix recommendations would make it most tailored to your individual experience, which means less of the least common denominator. That's actually a pretty cool point. I should have argued that. But anyway,
So to conclude this first argument, it should be obvious that we're winning the debate, but the obverse face of this argument is also quite damaging because the effect of the absent is in and of itself terrible when you justify it by saying it wasn't a big deal, because as closing opposition points out, many people and these depictions of LGBT individuals will still have to have come out in the first place, which means for many people for whom this is a big deal, for whom it is important, their feelings are explicitly invalidated because the nature of the story and the way that they would have to defocus it from coming out would necessarily implicate that these things are unimportant, you should not be caring about it, which means one, these people remain constantly repressed, two, these people go into a half-cocked and end up in much worse family situations, and three, they end up harming themselves because they don't know how important it is, or they feel like it is important, but never get acknowledged by media, and that's why we oppose.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition for that speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue this debate.
Can you hear me? Let's firstly talk about the nature of this medium. I think by its nature, because it's something that is not as prevalent, as in it is not necessarily to the prescription and ideas of the majority of the population, by itself, there is a more limited media time all over the place, meaning that big studios rarely make gay movies or like movies with big gay characters and things like that. A lot of people, like for example, in Hollywood, like to make less controversial movies in order to appease markets such as China, where things like that are literally banned and like generally appeal to international populations and stuff like that. But also like generally, it's a small part of the population that is disenfranchised, that has like generally less of a voice to pressure like these big studios and like even indie makers to actually make these movies. So a lot of the times it's very hard to gain the funding and the ability and the opportunity to create a movie like that. And I think why this is important. It is important because this limited media space necessarily trade-offs with other messagings that are just as important in terms of validating LGBT people's feelings and preferences and things like that. You can talk about messaging such as bullying. You can talk about realizing your own identity, a personal experience that is completely not necessarily connected to coming out. Like, I would generally like to reject the idea that is absolutely true for every LGBT person out there, that they would like to come out and that this is necessarily something that's important. It is based on the false perception that we need to validate our own feeling through others' people's, which puts you in a position that you are vulnerable to these people's opinions. And when these people's opinions are not what you have necessarily expected and they let you down, your own parents, your own family, your own friends, you experience extreme trauma, your life is ruined. I'm going to later on explain to you why that is likely on our side of the house. It also trades off things such as like relationships problems that LGBT people talks about, or historical figures that were LGBT that are important. And all of these are like normalizing messaging, helping people. So validating LGBT people's emotions can be done in different ways. Now look, let's talk about who are the people who are likely to come out and who are the people that we don't want to be pressured into coming out. I think a lot of the role models out there that LGBT people can prescribe to are generally likely to come out anyway. If you're a person in a position of power, such as politician, or if you're rich, if you're beloved, if you're a big artist, your ability to come out is huge because you have a huge support structure, your fans, your followers, people who have voted for you, or generally can just say, I don't give a fuck because I'm like a stable human being and I don't care about these people. But this is not, this is also true for like generally people of privileged backgrounds and things like that. Maybe they're white, maybe they're in a richer country and things like that. Maybe they just like generally privileged because they have a lot of friends who are liberal, or like a community such as debating where they has a lot of liberal friends. But structurally, this is not the case for many LGBT people out there. People who live in like countries with like religious backgrounds, people who live in places where this is literally banned, or like just generally, I think that LGBT people are structurally excluded from like having access to huge support networks and things like that. Why is this the case? In many of the cases, because you're different and you grow up in a society that, like, for example, pushes onto you gender norms and tells you have to feel like a boy or a girl necessarily to be normal, or like you have to like boys because you're a girl, or you have to like girls because you're a boy, and things like that. You necessarily feel different, especially during the process of like self-realization, and that in many of the cases makes you self-isolate, or like the friends that you have perpetuate a lot of these problematic stereotypes, so you don't feel as close to them and you can't come out to them in many of these cases. This necessarily comes down to the fact that you have like most LGBT people in many of these places can have only one or two friends that they can truly talk about, or like they have their only support system is their family and things like that. And these support structures are important because these are the people who you go to and they tell them when you had a bad day, you like disclose important decisions, where you want to go to school, should you marry that person, should you do that, should you do X, all of these crucial moments in your life that give you like important meaning, anxiety when you need support the most. But it's also like financial stability, your parents supporting you through college, your parents letting you live with them until you get side foods, like a friend giving you a job or a recommendation and things like that. And it's problematic because once you risk all of those things to come out, because you're pushed into believing that this will somehow solve all your problems and you're gonna feel like you're more in place and like your identity is now finally realized for some reason, this is when you're pushed into believing these things and you risk these people pushing you away. And it's not okay. I wouldn't like to live in this world, but this is the world that we live in. Many of these people are perpetuated by the media that they have read, by the things that they said, by what their God thinks or what they believe their God thinks, that these people are wrong, that they're gonna go to hell in certain cases, or just because they're thinking that they feel like another gender, or that they don't have a gender and things like that. So it's very hard for you to fight this support structures, and it's better in many of these cases for you to keep them, even if you don't fully disclose what you are to them, or you disclose it only to your friends but not to your parents. It's better because you're able to access a lot of these practical benefits and a lot of other support systems without like actualizing a lot of the things that you're saying. Before I continue with direct engagement closing.
Yeah. If your entire case is correct, then you feel terrible about lying to your parents and others. That means you're always consistently anxious, feel really bad, and aren't really able to engage with them to the fullest extent anyway.
But no, this is what I'm saying. By the absence of this media that it pushes you, it is not necessarily the case that you think about this as something as important. Media creates the perception that this is an important moment of your life of realizing your identity. I'll tell you that is not, and you cannot give me structural reasons that is the case for many people. Many people have multiple different interests that are not connected to your identity. Your identity should not be based on what they particularly believe in. But even if it's important to them, the fact that they are pushed into doing it and then their life crumbles is problematic on its own. A couple of things like that. First of all, validation of feelings. I already explained to you why, like, basically, if you prove to you that you're harmed, this is worse, and like you don't really get the benefit of validating your feelings. You can validate your feelings to other different ways. Creating a community is not unique to these particular things in terms of like there's gonna be popular culture to LGBT people and things like that. And finally, I think on social circles, I think people are far more likely to push you into believing that you have to come out to your parents or pressure into these things. But I generally don't think that like average Joe, who is most likely a homophobe because of the media that they grew up, is actually likely to watch these things in the first place. I'm very, very happy to give people a choice. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the opening half of this debate.
Hi, I'm assuming I can be heard. I'll take PYs in chat.
I can hear you.
Great, thanks. To an extent, Gov is right. The experience of coming out for many is one of the most terrifying and emotionally draining ones in their lives, and one that many people might actually want to avoid. But the problem is the reasons for why they want to avoid that experience are never explored in a world without the focus. Because the assumption is that these people are being cowards. Because the assumption is that these people don't exist to begin with. Because you never get details about what the experience is like. You never get portrayals of the heartbreak, of the regret of coming out. You never get an understanding for why these people are hesitant, and thus you assume it is easy for all gay people to exist, and that they ought come out in all those instances. The reality that Gov misses is that for the vast majority of LGBT people, it is an experience that they must eventually confront, whether it be to friends, family, coworkers, etc., because it's impossible to keep hiding your identity to the people you love and feel secure in those relationships, even in the most conservative context where this might be limited to your most personal and confided ones. The question of this debate then is how we can smooth out that experience for them. Clearly, it's a question that only OO has an answer to. 3 things in this speech. I want to first trivially observe how marginal the Gov case to this point is. Their case exists only in contexts that are conservative enough where the topic of coming out is taboo specifically, but then for some reason they also accept content talking about the bullying gay people face, the harassment gay people face, or even the possibility of gay relationships. Like, this is just so incoherent to me. Compare this, even if their case flies, to the vast majority of cases where we are just winning. What we point out is that the problem isn't that many people will be rejected. Many people assume they will be rejected and simply need the nudge of exposure to the process of coming out in order to get over that immense mental hurdle. It's because of this existing stereotypes that people don't realize that it's okay if your parents don't accept you right away. But in many of these conservative countries, they never even imagine the fact that they might be able to speak to their parents, they might be able to speak to their friends, they might be able to speak to their coworkers about it because there are no portrayals of it and the diverse ways it can play out. They have this homogenized image of the process in their minds, an image that never changes in that world. Which is why, even if you believe all of Gov's material, none of it makes sense in the context that matter. The second question I want to ask is, how is this content received by people in the process of coming out? Because the extent of Gov's case is to say that this pressures people in the closet and shames them into coming out. This falls on a few grounds. First, it's obviously predicated on these portrayals solely depicting the outcomes of coming out as good and fairy tale-esque, which is the only world in which this pressure would be to come out in all instances, and it's clearly one that's ridiculous. As we explained from David, no response from DPM, it's incredibly unlikely to be the case that these portrayals are dominant, both because of the existing incentives of media companies to compete on the accuracy of experience and the diversity of experiences represented, and because, secondly, it's not accurate to the actual experience of gay people in progressive countries. Like, even if you show these conservative countries, you will face cancel culture if you do it poorly and you do it wrong. So for the people that genuinely don't want to come out or have good reasons for not doing so, they're actually far better represented and characterized in our world, where there are more discussions of what coming out can be and the ways it can go wrong. So you understand the reasons why they might want to stay in the closet. You understand why it's not appropriate to ask someone up front about their gender identity, to ask, like, what pronouns should I call you? And all of these egregious things that many people say in meetings because they assume the process of coming out should be easy. It's when you have more portrayals of it that you get more nuanced discussions that arise. The second observation I'd make here is just to point out how uncomparative this claim is. There are many external forces that pressure you to come out. You see gay couples on social media. You have to you have to look for a partner at some point to which you would have to come out to someone. You have to confront your friends about that relationship. You have to talk to your parents to get that relationship legal and move on with your life. The point is that it's inevitable, even if some people might really not want to come out, it's unclear why we should favor them over the many, many people who will have to come out. And the win here is rather simple. The people who don't want to come out will be insulated from the worst harms of discrimination, insofar as nobody knows they're a member of the LGBT community and can't attack them viscerally for it. Whereas the people who do have to come out and want to come out are people who will have to face that criticism, who will have to go through those conversations, who will have to endure the worst of it, which is why our priority ought be to making their lives easier rather than the people Gov claims to defend. The third and final thing to say here is to engage even in the worst case, where this is about people with absolutely no capacity to come out. We still make their life better by giving them the focus on this content on 3 different grounds. The first is we give them the ability to express and engage in their identity and access communities without having to come out and yet talk about the process of coming out. So fandoms, public discourse, social circles, where you can be seen as a fan rather than someone who is implicitly talking about the experience of coming out because they are gay. There's no underlying assumption that you're a gay person, which allows you the freedom to ask other people about this experience, to ask, what was it like for you? Was the movie accurate to what it meant for you? And I want to note, their analysis that this can exist for other forms of gay media clearly doesn't fly, because the focus of these people's lives and the thing that is keeping them down is specifically the process of coming out. So they already know what discrimination is like. They have other metrics for getting that. You don't address the need these people have. I'll take OG before moving on.
But the problem is you're putting a complete false comparative. We can still portray people, we can still portray their experiences and gain most of your benefits without having the harm of people feeling like shit and having to come out in the wrong way, which you haven't weighed out yet.
No, I really don't think you get this. Like, the thing that makes them feel like shit is not the constant surrounding of the content. It's the fact that they see something they could have. They see it once in one movie. They cling to it forever. Like, you watch one gay love story, and for many people, that's the thing you identify with. The problem on your side of the house is you only have that one. You create one expectation of it without alternative understandings of how else it could play out. So if the problem is that these people feel like shit because they set expectations for themselves, you still give them something to set expectations on, but never something to correct those expectations on, because there's only ever one or a narrow set of presentation you afford them. The third and most important thing to say is, even in the instance where they can't come out, they at least are able to evaluate those preferences in a better way because they see what coming out can bring them, rather than just having conservative narratives, which is the case for many of these people, being the primary thing dictating what they think coming out will be like. So if it's true you live in a conservative state, many of your assumptions are built on unfounded things about what it's like to come out. You're told that you're going to go to hell immediately. You're told that you're going to be rejected immediately. You're banned from all family gatherings. And many of these things simply aren't true, even in the worst contexts. And the problem is that there's no way to challenge that assumption that keeps people down and gives them a very real anxiety through all moments of their life. At the end of this speech, it's clear, regardless of what kind of content, what kind of portrayal you think this emerges in, we are by far serving the most important actors in this debate, the people who will have no choice, the people who will have to face the tough conversations. For those reasons, oppose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech and welcome the government member to open the closing half of this debate.
Okay, I prefer audible POIs, please. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things opening misses that we'll fill in. Firstly, what is a positive alternative that is presented on our side that deals with the O case? Secondly, why this is bad, even in liberal communities, why it harms even those people, because it lacks the ability to show fluidity of identity, right? Firstly, on alternative narratives. So I think that OG is really thin on what the other types of presentation is, and OO is very uncharitable, right? Clearly, I think there's going to be presumably a similar amount of content that is LGBT in the society, and this is also not just about media, remember, it's about narratives, but it's about what does that look like that's missing so far, right? I think this is important as an OO. You can have a presentation of being a gay person that doesn't have coming out, and it doesn't just look like having the shittest life possible. What can be being gay without coming out? You can do things like softly signal to certain people, but not explicitly say that. Because, for example, maybe you value your privacy with your family about things like sexuality. Or secondly, really importantly, you could be closeted to like your family, but you could still live a gay life, right? You could still have certain people who you have relationships or with or friends who are in that gay community, but you don't actively say to everybody, it's not a norm that you just tell everybody about your sexuality. This is important in terms of responding to OO, because firstly, they say you feel shit if you see the possibility of coming out because you really want it. I think this is making the assumption that being gay means coming out, right? Okay, maybe you would like to tell your family, but if you can see a positive way of having your main desires, which is like finding relationships and stuff without coming out, I don't think that's really true. I think the thing that's shit is that the fact that there's so much of a focus creates the idea that this is an expectation. This is a challenge from OO that I don't think OG's dealt with. Why is this the case? Look, if you're a minority who's not included in the general narrative about life and about who you are and how you should live, you really are dependent on media and cultural narratives developing about how you are acceptably able to live. You're confused, you're scared about how to be part of society. You use those as a metric, right? If the very overwhelming narrative is coming out, then that's not seen as a choice, which is what we get on our side, as an option that you could take if that's something that personally would appeal to you, which means you get a lot of benefits. But instead, it's seen as the default. It's seen as something that is not there. So, for example, you don't get alternative positive portrayals, right? So even if it's not literally shown as something you're meant necessarily to be forced to do, you need to have an idea of what life could be like without coming out. The things I mentioned earlier. That's more likely to happen on our side, right? Because now the media can't just focus on coming out as the only gay narrative that they tell over and over again. You need to show a diversity of experiences. So you have media that is betraying people, for example, living an okay life even though they haven't come out. Yes, media sometimes focuses on negatives, but also there can be appeals to positives in terms of gay people want to watch it because it makes them feel a bit better about their life, right? So I think that there's going to be a reasonable amount of positive portrayal of people, for example, in more conservative communities, still being happy because they have their in-group, even if they're not out to everybody. This is important as well because it creates more diversity, right? For the reasons I've just said, you show more people from conservative areas or from less accepting areas in gay media. You don't just show the liberal bubble. That's because, as OO's conceded, there are certain people who the coming out narrative just doesn't apply to, right? You can't really make a story about a person coming out in like Qatar and getting executed. It wouldn't be very fun for most people to watch, right? But they seem to say that you're just going to address this in the media in a really vague way. You're not going to address it if the whole point of the media is to valorize coming out, which is what's seen as the default. But instead, you're showing that it's shit and it's a bad thing to do, right? It gets pushed aside. Only get on our side, which is how you get choice, which is why people feel agency. Another reason that you get pressure on Gev's side is because even if gay people recognize, on op side, even if gay people recognize that this isn't a choice, you get shitty stuff about your family, right? This is something that isn't given as a mechanism from OG, and it's really crucial, right? In the semi-liberal communities, you can often have an expectation because you have coming out as the main media that straight people form, that's something that they should expect. So, for example, your mother, even if they're semi-accepting of gay people, they're going to feel upset with you and annoyed with you if you don't tell them that you're gay because they think, well, that's the thing that you're supposed to do if you have this loving relationship. That's what media is showing. You must not trust me properly because if you're not coming out to me. That's bad for two reasons. Firstly, I already said, some people just want to be private about their sexuality, and this prevents them from being able to do that. Secondly, I think that coming out to a family member out of those kinds of pressures can often be bad, and we can take a much lower burden of proof than OG. It doesn't have to be throwing you out of the household, right? This is now moving on to talk about liberal areas. A lot of the time, it just looks like weird treatment that you don't like. Like now your mother who's sort of accepting of gay people but doesn't understand it or is a bit old-fashioned, like treats you in a stereotypical way, makes assumptions about you that you didn't like, uses language that feels inappropriate, or discusses things with their friends about you that feel personal. Those are the things that you get without having to be a super homophobic area, right? Those are the things that you get at the point where your family member is pressuring you. You know, your mother's upset with you because this is something you didn't expect. Alternatively, if a lot of the time there's privacy is an expectation that can be held, you can decide that it's okay to not have a relationship, to not tell those things to your family. That's important for further impacts in terms of why liberal areas are worse in this debate. I think this is weighing over OG because, well, first I already gave more mechanization of how conservative areas get better, but I think this is the most likely tipping point because there's obviously lots of other bad things going on for people's lives of gay people in conservative areas, right? So, but liberal areas are getting particularly worse for two reasons. Firstly, heteronormativity. This relates to the thing that I just said, right? At the point where you're going to have a more accepting community being formed over time, it's good to create a norm that being gay is an option, and that's something that people could be without them having to explicitly tell you. But this doesn't happen when you have a coming out narrative be the dominant thing, right? Because the coming out narrative suggests that, well, if somebody's gay, they're going to tell you about it. Otherwise, you can assume that they're straight. That's why you get the things like, again, your mother being disappointed with you because you didn't tell them. Or it means that your friends are going to other you or make you or pressure you to talk about things that aren't relevant to your life or that you have to lie about if you don't want to come out in order to fit in with that group. Or the alternative, a more liberal community would probably, if they didn't have a coming out narrative, would accept that you might be gay even if you weren't. I'll take the POI.
So this assumes that the default perception is positive and respectful without the focus, but an argument is this is only possible with the focus and that the default defaults to conservative norms that you're trying to avoid.
I think in conservative areas, I've said it's better because it shows an alternative lifestyle, even if it's not the ideal one. But in liberal areas, I think that there's still going to be relatively positive portrayal. The point is the nature of that portrayal. Because coming out narratives are usually well-intended but bad, right? Why? I've already just given you the reason on heteronormativity. That means that you don't get a good positive narrative. But secondly, putting yourself into a box, right? Usually coming out is something that's portrayed to be doing at a very young age when you're still finding your identity. You know, the sexuality and gender and stuff is really complicated, and it's really bad for people to have to choose something that's very fluid, to put themselves in a rigid box at a young age and then be perceived by that way, right? Or to have to simplify their identity so it's something that their straight family member can understand, right? They can't really express it. This is what ends up happening on the op side. What are the harms of this, right? firstly, you feel inauthentic. The thing that you wanted to do, which is for people to understand you, isn't actually done. You feel like you betrayed yourself because it's not really who you are. Secondly, as I said earlier, you then get portrayed on the stereotypes based on the simplified or misunderstood version of the straight people, which especially invalidates your identity, makes you feel especially marginalized. But thirdly, you end up with things like gatekeeping, like people expect you to act a certain way in order to really be a part of that community, right? I think it's better if you're able to have a live and let live attitude towards your sexuality. You don't feel pressure to decide who you are at a really young age, and you don't feel like when you do come out, you often regret that you didn't really get what you wanted because you didn't really express yourself. I think on op side, all you're getting is people going into putting themselves in a box that doesn't fit them, makes other people perceive them in a worse way, and prevents other narratives, which removes the agency of LGBT people. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank government member for that speech and welcome opposition member to continue this debate.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Resume yes. All right. Simple extension for closing opposition. LGBT media will exist on both sides of the house. We think there is still a massive profit incentive for these people to cater to movies that cater to a significant proportion of the population in both of these places. And I think there's a general interest in LGBT issues, which is the reason the movies which have the focus on coming out are made on the side of Gov in the first place. We're going to tell you why the counterfactual media is much worse. I think the first point to note here is that the counterfactual media will, and this, by the way, directly engages and flips opening government. The first thing to say here is that it will often show people who are already out. There are two kinds of things that happen here. Firstly, it'll show their romances and their drama in their dating life and other things like that, because that's often a massive source of their drama in the first place. This is more palatable and relatable to straight people, so it'll get a lot of airtime, and that will be the counterfactual focus on their side of the house. But the second thing is that they will show historical LGBT figures, as Nikki himself says at the bottom of BPM. This means that this is often unrealistic kinds of portrayals, right? Because these are the people who were like historical LGBT figures, like people like Harvey Milk, were often extremely privileged white people living in Western nations on their side of the house, because they were the people who had the ability to do these kinds of things in the first place. Critically, you get no portrayal of people who haven't come out, who are choosing not to come out in the first place, and aren't living very happy gay lives after their coming out process, because critically, you can't show the gay experience before you come out, because as Toby points out, these people aren't actually seen as gay in the first place. They aren't like explicitly gay, and they don't have gay interactions because they haven't come out to the society. So you can't portray this in the media. This means that on Gov's side, there is a massive portrayal of people who have already come out in gay media. Why is this bad? I think firstly because it flips OG, because more people feel the pressure to come out, because every single gay character that they see in the media, every single LGBT person they see is already out, is living a very happy life, living like already having relationships and being out to their family and friends already, because they don't have the entire dramatic process of coming out on their side of the house. This means that a lot of people feel the pressure to come out, even if they are not ready to, even if they don't have the support structures around them to, and don't have the same level, like all the harms of opening government kick in if they're in too much of a conservative society to be able to come out meaningfully. We don't put that pressure on people. We don't tell you that coming out is something that is essential for you to self-actualize as a gay person. But secondly, I think representation of people who haven't come out as a part of queer communities is extremely valuable as a principle, right? Because we don't think this is often done in status quo, right? Because we don't think that people talk about the fact that you are still queer if you like don't come out in the first place. Okay, like there's some material on this in opening opposition which just says that there is less media and you like benchmark onto the first movie you see. I think we are far better in our proof of mechanisms, because we don't just assume that there will be less media on our side of the house, but we show you why all the media, even if it's a lot, will still portray it particularly badly and portray it in a way that like incentivizes you to come out in the first place. We're not contingent. Opening government.
But we analyze that the process of coming out is specifically the thing that pushes people to do this. If it's just the outcomes, people do not view this stuff as super complex.
No. This is like not true, right? You prove that like the fact that people are shown as coming out means that they have to come out. But if you look at your analysis, it also works if you see everyone in the movies you see as come out already, openly gay to their families and living that life already. the same analysis works. It's just that it forces people to come out because you don't show the painful process behind it. You only show the outcome on your side of the house. That makes it much worse. Secondly, this is like a bit of a weird argument, but I think it's going to be working, and I'll provide tons of structural reasons to make it work. I think you get far worse portrayals because on our side of the house, you're able to portray children who are LGBTQ. Why is this particularly important? Because we think that the main big drama in gay children's lives is the act of coming out, right? That is the first queer experience that most people have, and that is something that uniquely happens at a young age for the vast majority of people. This means that you show a lot of drama around children. And on their side of the house, the counterfactual we showed you, the people who are having romantic lives, having active sex lives at their adult lives, or are showing historical people, are likely to be stories that happen at a much older age. We think it's particularly valuable to have, and this is like particularly important because media has an incentive to show extremely dramatic things, which means that the drama that happens in children, like queer children's lives, is specifically the drama around coming out, which means that the focus is necessary for you to show that sort of thing in the first, show this kind of portrayal of children, queer children in media in the first place. Why is it particularly important for kids to be portrayed in media? I think, as CG points out, kids feel less confident and are the most confused in their queer identity. So showing these queer children in screen makes them feel much more seen, makes them feel and understand their own self much better. But secondly, they're more controlled by parents, which means that media is particularly more valuable to how much of a change it can make on these children's lives specifically, because it doesn't impact because adults can seek out other sorts of media or community because they aren't controlled by their parents in the same way and don't need media for representation. They can seek it out in their real world. Fourthly, I think there's less backlash because you're showing like the fact that children are doing things and showing like support from parents being an important thing. We're less likely to get conservative backlash. You're also less likely to show like sex scenes and things like that in the romance counterfactual, which is probably going to cause massive amounts of backlash in the queer community. Now let's just do some line-by-line responses to stuff that we heard from OG and CG about why we make the decision process and the act of coming out much easier. Why do we make the decision process easier? I think we just show the consequences, right? Like Ruben's only analysis on why you don't show the consequences is because cliffhangers are good. This is stupid. We think that art mimics real life. That is to say that we think that there is an incentive to show the real experience of what queer coming out can do to you. And in these communities, like, art will tell the stories of people in the real world. If there is extremely bad responses to sometimes when people come out, the art has an incentive to show that because that creates drama that is extremely relatable to people on the ground, which means that you will show the consequences, which means we get far better analysis of the decision. But we also make the process of coming out much easier. And this is like stuff that like hints at the same impact but doesn't give you our mechanisms, because the process is particularly important. Firstly, I think it shows you that there are different ways to come out and there are ways to do it at different ages. I think the first example of this is you can do it to your friends, but not to your family. And that is like the CG response, but that only happens on our side when we show people interrogating their decision to come out to certain people, what level of trust is needed to show to certain people, and what kind of conversations you can have to probe if they may be good or not, good with it or not, before they have come out in the first place. These are ideas that children only get on our side of the house when they see different nuanced portrayals of how this happens. But secondly, it shows how friends and families respond, and this may be bad. Note that this is good because this is the same analogy as content warnings, right? Because the reason content warnings are good is not because like they often prevent you from hearing the thing, but being mentally prepared to hear negative responses in and of itself is extremely valuable as a form of defense against these kinds of things, and you're prepared for these things. We think that on our side of the house, the media that is portrayed in the counterfactual is far worse and doesn't focus on queer issues and actually just flips all of Gov Bench's harms. So we're very proud to stand in closing opposition.
I'd like to thank opposition member for that speech and welcome the government whip to continue this debate.
Okay, am I audible? Yeah, thank you. I'll take POs in the chat, not audibly, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to quickly tell you why CO fourth this round, then weigh over against opening government, and then finally opening opposition. So a couple of responses to closing opposition. Show people who are already coming out. I think they say LGBTQ media is symmetric, therefore their incentives must be. They're already knifing opening opposition, because opening opposition say that this counterfactual is one where there's a one-note coming out process, rather than you have portrayals of other things on our side of the house. So a lot of their material must be discounted if that's the case. But also, this is an assertion. The motion is lowering focus, but the coming out process is still there. Note that in narratives debates, there are other narratives. So pride parades and NGOs are probably likely to push this coming out narrative. Therefore, media has an incentive to make sure that they show people who are coming out as well. This is not a vacuumist debate. Then on diversity, most of it's derivative, but let's talk about the children's stuff. Why are media incentivized not to do this in the first place? Political capital issues. Parents are likely not to want to watch this, and they will probably censor their kids from watching this to begin with, but they probably won't want children in there because of the face of backlash. Second of all, teenagers. They can get the most money about this. Elo flippantly responded to this because they probably don't think that we're rappy enough, but they obviously just do lowest common denominator stuff and try to get the most capital amount as possible. Therefore, the coming of age films are probably more profitable for these people as they will focus on this, not children. But also, finally, there are complex themes, but they will, if they dilute it for kids, they'll get cancelled by the LGBT community for not representing them properly because they diluted it. Series out of the round, but extra responses which relate to the op bench as a whole. For social roles, especially minorities, descriptions are probably equated with prescriptions. For example, women are nurturing becomes women should do childcare, which means making coming out the norm, if that invalidates and excludes those who don't want to come out or can't. So also at best, Sio's point works for people who cannot come out. It still invalidates those who can but don't want to. Let's then do some weighing against a government bench. I want to be clear. I think that we do a couple of things, and Ruben's nodding because he thinks we're derivative, but I want to make it absolutely clear what we're doing. Right. I want to say what opening government does and what we do, and I think this is really important, and this is probably the most important stuff I'm going to say. Opening government give similar mechanization, but they say the removal of it leads to less anxiety. They provide no counter-characterization about what positive alternatives look like and respond to OO's best case as to then why, because they're vulnerable to OO, why the diversity actually happens on and how it affects external people and non-LGBT people. At the end of this, room will probably be sad-faced, not nodding at this. How do we weigh against opening government? One, the biggest thing, I think the strongest thing, is the rigid box fluidity stuff that Alistair gives. Because note, opening government go, the process of coming out is going to be portrayed. This leads to stress and anxiety. There's no mechanization in opening government about why that is generally descriptive and prescriptive, like the response I gave to opening and closing opposition, which leads to inauthenticity. Opening government already talked about stress and trauma. This is strong because the weighing here is it's long-term weighing versus short-term weighing. Because this creates path dependency where you must go down being a twink, must go down being a jock or something like that, and you feel like you have to go through that rigidly. This is stronger because the process analysis from opening government is short-termist and is not engaging with this to begin with. Then the rest of the stuff that I want to respond to is opening government. Opening government say it impacts wider society, and they'd have no characterizational mechanisms, how it changes interaction specifically for individuals or the proximity that they have to individuals elsewhere. Nikki doesn't explain why support mechanisms actually increases. We take a higher burden and explain why support increases. I'll explain why we do that in a minute. And there's actually no analysis from Nikki either where problematic stereotyping in the media come down. So at the end of this, I'm going to weigh in a minute why opening government assume that coming out experiences are good, and we're going to explain why we get diversity, which is good regardless whether it's good or bad. So what's happening here? One, this is a trivial response to OO and OG, is that diversity would just exist symmetrically for the reasons that David responded to flippantly to my POI. If Elo concedes that algorithms are specific to the people that exist in those countries, then presumably liberal or conservative societies like Alistair tells you and Mechanized will probably have different coming out experiences depending on their area. So the diversity would just exist symmetrically. But also on OO's push about exposure, CG gets that for all the reasons we tell you, that to be profitable, you need a diversity of experiences because it validates those who don't come out because of soft signaling effects. This is known as glass cabinet, right? So you portray like gay things, you do gay actions or like stereotypically gay things. Where you don't like say, oh, I'm gay. I'm just telling you and letting you know that I'm gay and stuff like that. Which is what Alistair talks to you about soft signaling. That's what's going to be promoted on our side of the house more. This is a better positive alternative than opening government is giving you about that to begin with. This means people in your proximity are not going to be like, when are you going to come out? When are you going to bring a boyfriend next time round and stuff like that? And if you don't, if you don't do that, then you're seen as not gay, quote unquote. This pushes against opening opposition, who talks about validation, but also CEO and the member can see that these dynamics already exist, which means that we provide extra information to these people in general, because now you get a diversity of preferences, where you now have diversity of experiences that you can see on the media, about how external people and non-LGBTQ people should interact with your LGBT people. Because if OO and CO are right, that non-LGBT people watch this as well because of the pervasiveness in the media and how it's just generally very positive, then presumably they learn more about how to approach these things to begin with, and they will probably learn more about how to operate with them to begin with. Before responding to opening opposition, sure, I'll take them.
So this diversity stuff misses the point of the analysis. Our point is that there isn't diverse enough media to even be recommended in the first place in the counterfactual. And worse off is that this diversity doesn't focus on the most important part to be diverse on, namely the coming out.
Yeah, okay. So presumably on our side, if you're right and you push that there's not a focus on coming out, but you yourself said that coming out will be a part of it, presumably on our side, as I tell you, the plot lines have to be more diverse, they have to be more nuanced. You can't have the lowest common denominator. We go like, oh, I've come out, the gay character can get out the scene and they can no longer exist in the movie. You have to spend more time unraveling these things. You yourself conceded this, that there has to be more complex storylines on our side, but also just the diversity stuff. With the algorithm stuff that you responded to, you literally conceded you would get diversity on our side of the house anyway. Okay, they say exposure on open position is more important. 3 things that we explain. 1, the nature of these means that we get better exposure. Secondly, we don't push people into a box and have stereotypes. A couple of other responses. 1, on our side, I think that validations of feelings are most important to you. Not TV, but people who are close to you. Note that your identity is shaped more by your community and proximity. That's why we beat top half, because the interactions you have with people are better on our side, rather than TV telling you about your identity. This is how we beat open in government, right? Which means, on our side, on their side, there's more gate kept, because the diversity of stuff is likely to be more privileged people who can come out. We're not reppy, but we've definitely won this debate and we're going through first. And for all those reasons, I'm so proud to propose.
I would like to thank Government Whip for that speech and welcome Opposition Whip to conclude this debate.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. 3, 2, 1. First, differentiation from opening opposition. Look, opening opposition gave you what I think is a case about exposure of the LGBT identity around focus media. What they missed is the comparative, i.e., what media exists in a world where the focus is not on coming out. Note what Rohan adds. Rohan told you that the likely kind of media that you get on their side is obviously media which depicts gay people that exist. The reason for this is there's many woke people around, obviously, and therefore you get media that depicts them. But this is crucially only after the fact, i.e., the only media you can get is media that tells you you've already come out and therefore this exists. What this is likely to look like? This is probably media that is about historical figures, people who were gay in the past, probably some war and other kinds of things, or things like drama and romance, which people tend to opt into in the vast majority of instances. Notably, these are unlikely to focus on things like struggle and other things, which means that you are likely to focus on the romantic or dramatic aspects of an individual's lives at the point where you don't engage in this. This crucially mechanizes an important thing, which is just that the representation that opening and closing government want to talk about doesn't exist, i.e., the counterfactual is still that the kind of media that you see, that the people around you, and the way you watch media, every single thing about you is still those who are already gay and are out and loud and proud. This means that when I view a movie and I am gay, I still do not see it as something that is representative of me because I am not living that life. It is a false narrative that is necessarily spread. Note that this is different from OO because opening opposition at best says, guys, maybe you will get some degree of identitarian pushes, and they say, guys, you're going to get 1 or 2 coming out movies. CG says this is a knife. I just don't think so, right? Because we're fine with saying there's 1 movie about coming out. We're just telling you that the movies that replace this, the other 30, are obviously already about people who have come out, because you cannot structurally have movies about the process before it because you do not know these kinds of lives, because obviously this movie will not make a drama. Secondly, Rohan adds a pretty crucial frame, which is just why it's unlikely to talk about teens and others. The coming of age stories that CG mentions are the exact stories that we likely get significantly more, because when you discuss the process of coming out, it's often an 18 to 20-year-old who's quite confused about their identity. That means you get discussions around narrowly tailored age groups, which are likely quite good. No, opening opposition says, guys, we get discussion about identity. We specify this to particular age groups who are particularly relevant and are likely suffering the most. That means they're quite different and often add a significant amount to opening opposition. What does closing government give you? Their first extension is, guys, we're going to have a lot of individuals and you're going to be able to interrogate the idea of being able to come out significantly, right? The first thing I want to note is that I'm just very unclear how this is gov ground, right? I just think this is up ground if you come out with some individuals. Note that when you have a variety of media that focuses on coming out, you are likely going to focus on family and friends. You're going to talk about, hey, maybe these are groups you should come out to and these are groups you shouldn't. That means you likely have significant representation on our side of the house on these exact processes. The kind of thing that you engage with in finding an in-group is uniquely possible on closing opposition rather than closing government. Secondly, though, I'm just unclear why they get the narrative that they want, which is, guys, you're going to get a lot of soft signaling on other types of things. Firstly, I'm just unclear what incentive the media has to make these kinds of things. Media is largely profit-driven. They want dramatic stuff. They likely want things that are loud, proud, and often have significant numbers of viewership. That means that soft signaling, or just the idea, guys, you can live a small secret life, is not something that the vast majority of books want to depict, because they recognize that the mainstream audience, which they often want to cater to, but they have a profit incentive, likely doesn't want to watch this. That means because the narrative isn't catchy and it's unlikely to exist, you just never get this kind of depiction. Crucially, this means that the first part of closing government extension either only exists within our world, where you can depict coming out to some extent, or it does not exist at all because the media isn't catchy enough, because it's not something that the average stockholder wants to represent. The second thing to say is, guys, family and other expectations change within liberal areas. I have like a few responses to this. Firstly, is better than the comparative, right? Because you at least discuss in media, and your mother is probably was, hey, maybe my child is not coming out to me because they don't necessarily feel completely trustworthy. That means that at the very least, you get some information about this. Secondly, though, we think other narratives exist, and this is really, really important, right? Obviously, in the vast majority of instances, your parents were heterosexual, and that means that they expected that the way they engaged with their parents, the fact that they talked about their relationship with their parents, was a sign of trust. So other narratives already meant that you did not want to engage with them on the comparative, but that they already placed these kinds of pressures. That means that you always see your family as something, hey, why didn't they talk to me and all of that? Which means this is broadly symmetric. The only question that we change on our side is when this media is more existent. You talk about, maybe my child is completely comfortable. Maybe I should give them space. Maybe I can understand the process that they went through when I internalize and learn about this media, so I'm likely to think about it. That yields mostly closing government. I only want to give one more response, which was, guys, you have other narratives so you can learn about NGOs and other things. Two things. One, I'm very unclear why NGO narratives are important, right? NGOs are very tiny, often don't have much control over narratives, but media is big. It's likely going to be the thing that the vast majority of individuals watch, so you're unlikely to be wanting to engage with it to the extent that closing government wants to talk about. That means the vast majority of your identity is probably shaped by Netflix, probably shaped by YouTube, because you watch this to a much larger extent than the NGO that they wanted to talk about. Let's deal with opening government. Opening government has a few pushes. The first push they have is, guys, there's other types of media that you can engage in. The first thing to say is that I'm just very unclear why you're going to watch this other type of media or why it's created. Note that the process of coming out, like they say, is dramatized. It's huge. So you're likely to want to watch it on the comparative because it has a large profit incentive. Secondly, I just think that means that the kinds of media you get in either world are quite dramatic, which means you should your focus onto other mainstream topics. This looks like gay romance. This looks like historical figures who many people want to talk about, which are often conservative white men, which likely is the comparative that exists on opening government. I'll take opening government before I do a second piece of engagement with them.
Wait, even if you're right and outcomes push you to come out sometimes, this happens in relatively small situations since outcomes are very unclear, whereas the process is 100% clear and 100% you'll get the message for this.
Right. Let's then talk about the second part. The second thing then is why you are likely to come out within their world and why you don't know anything about coming out on the comparative. The first thing to say is when I watch media about literally everyone in my community is having come out, that means the only way I feel included within the community is when I have come out, i.e. I feel like the only way for me to live the truth as a gay person, the only way I relate to literally everyone within the media I consume, you often want to role model yourself after them, which means you engage in it. Secondly, outcomes are very, very clear because you recognize these people are happy. They're living a life. They're quite happy and satisfied with the way they're engaging. That means outcomes are crystal clear within their world and are often quite terrible. Thirdly, we would say that the comparative is that you obviously don't demonstrate things like bullying and other things on their side of the house. The reason for this is quite simple. Obviously, this is stuff that, one, is intrinsically linked to coming out, but secondly, if you are able to target this, I think the problem that exists within their world is that it's intrinsically linked to coming out in the vast majority of cases, so you're unlikely to be able to depict the full extent of this, which is probably a lot more problematic. The last thing they say is, guys, you can have good relationships without this. One, I think this is just untrue. Structurally, if you don't discuss many important things with your parents, you can't talk about your relationships and other things. You often feel excluded, which means you cannot have these good relationships. I'm very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Opposition Whip for that speech and thank all teams for what was an excellent debate. I'd like to also ask all teams to now leave the breakout room so that the panel can have a discussion. But good luck with your future debates.
Thanks for the round, everyone.
Okay, presumably we'll spend the next 3 to 5 minutes deliberating, and once we, at the end of those 3 to 5 minutes, we'll come back together and have a discussion. Also, I'm unsure, is this room still streaming? Should be fun while we deliberate, but let's hope they leave in the next 3 to 5 minutes.
Alexandra, are you there? We can check again before, and I can tag on Discord as well.
It's been roughly 4 minutes, but presumably we'll just wait until streaming ends.
I'll tag them on Discord.
Yeah, excellent.